Picture this. It is 10 o'clock in the morning, Eastern Time. A tanker loaded with Iranian crude oil is moving through one of the most important waterways on the planet. The captain receives a warning broadcast over the radio. American naval forces are ordering the vessel to turn back. Not a drill, not a threat. An actual live enforced naval blockade. The first of its kind by the United States in decades. And just like that, the world changed. This is not a hypothetical scenario. This morning, the blockade officially began. And what you are about to hear is going to show you exactly why this single move could reshape the Iranian economy, reroute the global energy market, force China into an impossible position, and either push Iran toward the most consequential peace deal in a generation or drag the entire region into something far more dangerous. Stay with us because this one has layers you are not going to want to miss. Welcome to World Brief Daily. If you are new here, we break down the most critical global developments with the depth and clarity they deserve. Hit that subscribe button right now and enable notifications because in a situation this fluid, new developments are coming in by the hour, and you do not want to be the last to know. Let us start with exactly what happened this morning and what it actually means in practice. The United States Central Command officially announced that as of 10 in the morning Eastern Time on April 14th, American forces began implementing a blockade of all maritime traffic entering and exiting Iranian ports. The statement was precise. The blockade applies impartially to vessels of all nations entering or departing Iranian ports and coastal areas, including all Iranian ports on the Arabian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. According to Central Command, however, American forces will not impede freedom of navigation for vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz between non-Iranian ports. In other words, if your tanker is heading to Saudi Arabia, to Iraq, or to the United Arab Emirates, you are fine. If you are heading to Iran, you are turning around. Now, the White House had initially framed this much more broadly. Speaking just before the blockade was announced, the president called it a complete blockade. All or none, he said, meaning no ship passes until Iran relents. Central Command's clarification narrowed that scope considerably. But make no mistake, the practical impact on Iran is still devastating. Here is why. Iran's economy is deeply, almost existentially dependent on sea trade. This is not hyperbole. The numbers make the argument on their own. On a daily basis, Iran exports approximately $270 million worth of goods. Out of that, around $140 million is crude oil. The rest, roughly $80 million per day, consists of non-oil products. Petrochemicals, minerals, steel, metals, all of it moves through the sea. And then there is the import side. Last year, Iran imported approximately $58 billion in goods. That comes out to around $160 million per day, covering everything from consumer products to the raw materials that keep Iranian factories running. Now all of that is at risk. Let us run the numbers slowly because this is where the severity of the situation becomes impossible to ignore. On the export side alone, Iran stands to lose roughly $8 billion every single month. That is not a rounding error. That is an economy-stopping figure. And on the import side, if raw materials stop coming in, Iranian factories run out of inputs. When that happens, production stops. When production stops, people lose jobs. And when people lose jobs in a country that is already sitting on years of accumulated economic frustration, things get dangerous for the regime. This brings us to something critically important that a lot of analysts are overlooking right now. The protests that shook Iran did not begin as calls for revolution. They began as economic protests. People were angry about mismanagement. They were angry about rising prices, about shortages, about a government that seemed indifferent to their suffering. Those economic protests escalated into something the regime barely survived, and only survived through brutal force. But the economic problems that ignited those protests never disappeared. They only got worse. And now, with this blockade, they are about to get dramatically, catastrophically worse. And here is the part that should terrify Iranian officials above everything else. Time is not on their side. Look at Iran's oil storage situation. Iran has roughly 50 to 60 million barrels of storage capacity across its oil depots. Right now, approximately 60% of that capacity is already used up. That leaves only around 20 million barrels of spare capacity. Iran is producing roughly 1.5 million barrels of crude oil every single day. Do the math. That means in approximately 2 weeks, Iran's spare storage capacity is completely full. At that point, Iranian oil companies will have no choice. They will be forced to shut down oil wells. And shutting down oil wells is not like flipping a switch back on. Each time you shut down a well, you permanently lose between 5 and 10% of its extraction capacity. That is money that is gone forever, from a regime that is already desperately short of it. This is not just an economic crisis. This is a ticking clock, and the regime knows it. Now, before we go any further, if you are getting value from this breakdown, make sure you are subscribed to World Brief Daily and have your notifications turned on. We are covering this story in real time, and you are not going to want to miss the next update. Let us now talk about how Iran is responding, because the response has been equal parts threatening and deeply ironic. Iran's military spokesperson declared that American restrictions on vessels are illegal. Iran's Parliamentary National Security and Foreign Policy Commission called the blockade a bluff. A spokesperson for that commission wrote publicly that the move would be considered an act of war and warned that Iran may also reveal other cards that we have not yet used in this game. He told American leadership to respect Iranians, accept your defeat, and do not demand at the negotiating table what you failed to achieve in war. Extraordinary language. But let us hold that up to the light for a moment. This is the same regime that spent months attacking civilian shipping from countries that had absolutely nothing to do with this conflict. A civilian ship flying the flag of Thailand was attacked by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Thailand, a country on the other side of the world. Iran was conducting what amounted to maritime extortion, charging vessels up to $2 million in transit fees just to pass through the Strait of Hormuz, a waterway that under international law belongs to everyone. Those toll fees were very real, very significant, and legally indefensible. So when Iranian officials call the American blockade an act of war and an illegal provocation, the only appropriate response is to suggest they look in a mirror. Iran's armed forces went further, calling the blockade outright piracy. The Revolutionary Guard warned that any military vessels approaching the Strait of Hormuz will be considered a violation of the ceasefire and will be met with severe force. According to Iran's semi-official news agencies, Iran's acting defense minister announced the country's armed forces were on maximum combat alert. And yet, despite all of this fire-breathing, the ceasefire is technically still holding. Pakistan's prime minister confirmed on Monday that the ceasefire remained in place and that efforts were ongoing to reach a diplomatic solution. The dialogue has not collapsed entirely. Not yet. But the pressure is building fast. Now, let us talk about what this blockade actually looks like in practice. Because enforcing a naval blockade in one of the world's most congested and strategically sensitive waterways is not a simple operation. According to ship tracking data, by early Monday morning, well before the blockade officially began, traffic through the Strait of Hormuz had already dropped sharply. Vessels were steering clear. One tanker registered in Comoros under a name previously sanctioned by the United States for involvement in the sale and transportation of Iranian petroleum was identified passing through the strait after the blockade took effect. Another registered tanker reportedly turned around 41 minutes after the deadline, changing its intended destination from Oman to the United Arab Emirates. Another vessel began broadcasting a drifting status off the coast of Keshem Island, apparently stalling and waiting to see what happens next. As of this morning, 31 vessels had passed through the Strait of Hormuz in the prior 24 hours compared to the much higher normal traffic volumes. Of those, 6 were carrying cargo, oil, chemical products, or liquefied petroleum gas. The rest were sailing light or their load status was unknown. Legal experts are watching this closely. According to a retired Navy captain and director of a prominent national security law program, The legality of the blockade will hinge on how it is carried out. International law requires that any blockade be officially announced, enforced impartially against all nations, and that humanitarian aid, including food and medicine, must be allowed through. The United States appears to be aware of these requirements. Central Command issued formal notices to mariners prior to the blockade's start time. But as security studies experts have noted, this looks less like a clean historical blockade and more like a messy, high-risk interdiction regime, requiring American naval forces to identify, track, hail, divert, and potentially board vessels, all while operating in one of the most crowded shipping lanes on Earth. The American military assets positioned to enforce this blockade are substantial. Central Command currently has an aircraft carrier, 11 destroyers, and an amphibious group operating in the Middle East. Additional destroyers and carrier assets are deployed in the Mediterranean. On Saturday, American military vessels had already entered the strait to clear mines previously laid by Iranian forces, a necessary precondition for any serious enforcement operation. According to the White House, speaking outside the Oval Office on Monday, their whole Navy is underwater. You know that 158 ships are gone, their Navy is gone, most of their mine droppers are gone. That is a staggering assessment of how degraded Iran's naval capability has become since the war began on February 28th. Whether or not every detail of that claim holds up, the strategic picture is clear. Iran's ability to directly contest the blockade militarily is severely limited. But Iran has other cards to play. And one of them involves a body of water that you need to understand right now. Iranian officials have begun explicitly threatening to escalate the conflict to the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. Some of you may already know this choke point, but for those who do not, the Bab el-Mandeb sits at the southern end of the Red Sea, connecting it to the Gulf of Aden. It is, in terms of global commerce, just as important as the Strait of Hormuz. A significant portion of the oil that once moved through Hormuz has been rerouted through the Red Sea and past the Bab el-Mandeb to reach Asian markets. And just north of the Red Sea sits the Suez Canal, the artery that connects Asian trade to European markets and vice versa. Any disruption at Bab el-Mandeb has global consequences, and Iran knows this. Iran's threat is not hypothetical. Iran controls the Houthis in Yemen. Last year, the Houthis launched an extended campaign of missile and drone attacks against commercial shipping in the Red Sea that lasted months before a combined air campaign pushed them back. They can do it again if Tehran orders them to. It is a major concern that the Iranians may try to use one of their largest proxies to launch missiles or drones at vessels in the Red Sea. The Houthi threat was already deterred once, but deterring it again, while simultaneously enforcing a blockade in the Strait of Hormuz, would stretch American and allied naval resources significantly. This is part of Iran's calculation. Now, here is the dimension of this story that most Western coverage is not paying enough attention to, and it could end up being the most important factor of all. China. Almost all of Iran's oil exports go to China. According to trade data, this accounts for roughly 11 to 13% of total Chinese oil imports. And if you factor in the shadow fleet arrangements that officially do not exist, but very clearly do, that number might be even higher. But here is where it gets truly extraordinary. China does not just depend on Iran for oil. China depends on the entire Gulf region, and the vast majority of that oil moves through the Strait of Hormuz. Break it down. Russia supplies roughly 20% of China's oil imports. Iran supplies around 13%. Saudi Arabia, Iraq, the UAE, Oman, Kuwait, all those countries ship their oil through the Strait of Hormuz. Add it all up and you are looking at approximately 50% of China's entire oil supply that depends on this one waterway. And who effectively shut down the Strait of Hormuz? Iran did, not the United States. Even now, with the blockade in full force, Central Command has been explicit. The United States is only targeting ships bound for Iranian ports. Every other vessel heading to Gulf ports is free to move. The disruption to non-Iranian Gulf shipping is entirely of Iran's making because Iran closed the strait, laid mines, and started charging tolls. That puts China in an extraordinarily uncomfortable position. We know from reporting just last week that China had already applied quiet pressure on Iran, helping to broker the talks in Islamabad that took place over the weekend. Beijing needs this conflict to de-escalate. It needs the strait open. It needs Iranian oil, but more importantly, it needs Gulf oil, and right now it is getting neither reliably. The expectation in Washington, according to sources familiar with American strategy, is that Beijing will increase this pressure. Every day the strait remains disrupted is a day China's energy security erodes a little further. China consumes more oil than any other country in the world. It cannot sustain this indefinitely. This brings us to what happened in Islamabad and what the 21 hours of negotiation inside that conference room actually revealed. The vice president traveled to Pakistan to lead the American delegation. On the Iranian side, the chief negotiator was the Speaker of Iran's parliament, a significant delegation reportedly numbering around 100 officials. 21 hours of talks, and yet no deal. Here is what we know about what was on the table. According to officials cited in major news reports, the 6 core American red lines presented by the vice president were: 1. Iran must end all uranium enrichment. 2. The dismantling of all major nuclear enrichment facilities. 3. The retrieval of all highly enriched material. 4. A fully reopened Strait of Hormuz without tolls. 5. A broader peace framework that includes regional allies. And 6. An end to the funding of proxy groups, including Hezbollah in Lebanon and the Houthis in Yemen. Notably absent from this list were any conditions on Iran's ballistic missile program. That appears to have been quietly set aside in the interest of making a deal possible. The United States was also reportedly seeking a 20-year freeze on all Iranian nuclear enrichment activities. In exchange, presumably, a long-term framework would be renegotiated before that freeze expired. Here is where it gets interesting. Despite the public posturing, Iranian officials were reportedly willing to discuss the nuclear issue. But the gaps between the two sides remained enormous. And there was another problem, a structural one that exposed just how fragile the Iranian negotiating position really is. The person with the actual authority to make a final decision was not in the room. The vice president himself confirmed this, stating that during the 21-hour marathon session, he called the White House approximately half a dozen times, possibly more. The Iranians, however, were terrified to make a similar call back to Tehran. They were worried about the security risk. They were afraid that an intelligence agency might be monitoring the call and able to track it. So Iran showed up with 100 officials, and none of them had the authority to say yes. This tells us two things simultaneously. First, the Iranian regime is so fragmented and so deeply paranoid that it could not even conduct secure communications during the most important diplomatic moment it has faced in years. The gap between Iran's public assertiveness and its internal dysfunction is wider than most people realize. Second, and this is crucial, it means the negotiating process is not over. Iran's delegation took the American proposals back to Tehran. Whoever holds actual power in that system, whether it is the supreme leader, Revolutionary Guard commanders, or some combination thereof, is now sitting with those proposals. They can accept them, they can reject them, or they can send back a counterproposal. And if that counterproposal is even in the ballpark of what Washington will accept, then a deal is still possible. The vice president, speaking to news media on Monday, was careful with his words. He told reporters that the ball is in Iran's court. He said it was up to the Iranians whether there would be more direct talks, and the president himself, despite announcing the blockade, told reporters outside the Oval Office that Iran wants to make a peace deal very badly. Those two statements, announcing a blockade while saying the other side wants peace, reflect the delicate, high-stakes game being played right now. It is also worth pausing on the legal dimension of the Islamabad process because it adds another layer of complexity. The ceasefire that created the window for these talks came into force after the president threatened to obliterate what he called the whole civilization of Iran if it did not reopen the waterway. The Iranian foreign minister then confirmed that safe passage through the Strait of Hormuz would be possible through coordination with Iran's armed forces. But what coordination actually meant in practice, specifically the tolling regime that Iran began imposing, was precisely the flashpoint that blew the Islamabad talks apart. According to officials speaking to major networks, the talks ultimately broke down because Iran would not concede on ending uranium enrichment, would not agree to dismantle its enrichment facilities, and refused to fully open the strait without conditions. Israel, for its part, was entirely supportive of the blockade decision. The Israeli Prime Minister confirmed in a cabinet statement that his government is in full coordination with Washington and endorsed the blockade as a direct consequence of Iran violating the rules of the ceasefire negotiations. Meanwhile, the international community is not standing still. The French president announced preparations for what he called a peaceful multinational mission aimed at restoring freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz. He confirmed he would be convening a joint conference with the United Kingdom in the coming days to coordinate international efforts. The British Prime Minister is reportedly already engaged on the energy price dimension because Europe is bleeding. The European Union energy crisis triggered by the Iran war has already cost the 27-nation bloc more than 22 billion euros in higher fossil fuel bills. The European Commission president announced that Brussels will present emergency energy cost plans next week, and Brent crude oil has risen by approximately 40% since the war began, with prices nearing or surpassing $100 a barrel on Monday. The Energy Secretary acknowledged on Monday at an economic conference that oil prices will likely continue to climb until meaningful ship traffic gets through the blockaded strait. And he projected that peak pricing could occur sometime in the next few weeks, which means the pain at the pump is not over. Not yet. The Speaker of Iran's parliament seemed almost to relish this point, posting a photo of an American gas station sign on social media with the caption, "Enjoy the current pump figures with the so-called blockade. Soon, you'll be nostalgic for $4 to $5 gas." A remarkable thing to say publicly, even by the standards of this conflict. But let us put the global oil market picture into its full context, because this is not just about what people pay at the pump. Brent crude, the international standard, was sitting around $70 per barrel before this war began. It is now hovering near $112 a barrel according to live market data. That is a 40% increase driven almost entirely by Iran's closure of the Strait of Hormuz. Almost a fifth of the world's entire oil and gas supply normally moves through that 21-mile-wide channel. Beyond oil and gas, the strait is also a major corridor for fertilizer, aluminum, and helium shipments. The economic ripple effects touch agriculture, manufacturing, and technology sectors worldwide. Spain's defense minister called the blockade another step in an escalating crisis, warning that the consequences extend well beyond Iran and the United States. The United Nations Secretary General, through his spokesman, stated bluntly that there is no military solution and called on both parties to maintain the ceasefire and pursue dialogue. And even Russia, hardly a neutral party in any of this, expressed concern. The Kremlin spokesman warned that the blockade will continue to negatively impact international markets, calling it a situation where many details remain unclear. Coming from Moscow, that is as close to genuine alarm as you are going to hear expressed diplomatically. But here is the reality. Iran is the country running out of time, not the United States. Let us bring all of these threads together because the picture they form is one of extraordinary strategic tension. The United States has deployed one of the most powerful naval forces ever assembled in the Middle East. The blockade is live. Iranian oil exports are effectively frozen. Iranian storage capacity will be full in approximately 2 weeks, at which point well shutdowns begin, causing permanent, irreversible economic damage to a regime that is already struggling to survive. The Iranian economy is dependent on sea trade for its survival. Domestic economic pressure is building. The memory of past protests that nearly toppled the regime, is not far from anyone's mind in Tehran. At the same time, the diplomatic window has not closed. The ceasefire, however fragile, is technically still in place. Dialogue, even without a scheduled meeting, has not been declared dead. Pakistan is still mediating. China is applying pressure from the sidelines, and at least according to American officials, Iran came to the table in Islamabad genuinely willing to discuss the nuclear question. The next 72 hours will be decisive. Iran can choose the path of escalation, activating the Houthis, threatening Gulf shipping, attempting to challenge the blockade militarily. That path leads somewhere very dark and very costly for everyone. Or Iran can make the calculation that its position deteriorates by the hour, that its economic clock is ticking louder than its military threats, and that the time to negotiate while it still has something to negotiate with is now. The question is whether whoever holds real power in Tehran understands the situation as clearly as the numbers describe it. And that, my friends, is exactly the kind of question that never gets answered by waiting. It gets answered by watching closely, by staying informed, and by understanding the economic, military, and diplomatic forces at work beneath the headlines. That is what we do here at World Brief Daily. If you have not subscribed yet, right now is the moment. Hit subscribe, enable notifications because this story is moving fast, and we are committed to giving you the clearest, deepest analysis every single time there is a development worth understanding. We will keep you updated as this situation evolves, and based on everything we have laid out today, it is going to evolve quickly.